And now it's a great pleasure to introduce this afternoon's speaker. Professor Nancy Krebs is with us from the University of Colorado. And she's been around today, and I've learned a little bit about her sort of career path as well, and we'll share with you some of what I've learned and also bits and pieces from her bio. So she's a professor of pediatrics at the University of Colorado and also leads their section on nutrition in the Department of Pediatrics. She was an undergraduate at Iowa State University and then went on to an MS at the University of Maryland and worked as a nutrition researcher in Colorado for a number of years under Michael Hambidge, who was, I think, primarily involved in research in zinc in women and infants. And then decided to go to medical school, stayed on at the University of Colorado through medical school residency and a fellowship in pediatrics and pediatric gastroenterology, so has collected multiple board certifications in general pediatrics, clinical nutrition, and pediatric gastroenterology. She has quite extensive research experience in micronutrient research, and this started out primarily based in the US around something that I hadn't even realized was an issue here, which was zinc deficiency in US infants prior to widespread supplementation of food in the US with zinc. And through this, she eventually sort of tumbled to international research, bringing her to our attention. Her initial work, she looked at, again, zinc in relation to mothers and infants and infant growth, and then more recently has been working on trials through the NIH and NICHD. They have a global network for women's and children's research, and Professor Krebs led a multi-country, I think, sites throughout South Asia, Africa, and Latin America, study of the efficacy of food-based supplementation, complementary feeding on growth, faltering, and development. I think in this afternoon's lecture we'll learn some of what happened with that study and may learn at least some of the answer to the question posed by her title, Global Stature, is there a role for postnatal nutrition? I'll just wind up by saying Professor Krebs is also sort of a classic clinician, researcher, educator. She has continued to be an educator and advocate for nutrition education in medical education. She continues to run a clinic a half a day a week, and in that clinic works particularly around nutrition for infants and children with feeding problems as well as around problems of obesity. And finally, in terms of a number of sort of national level awards and recognition, she has been on the Committee for Nutrition for the American Academy of Pediatrics for 10 years and served for 4 years as chair of that committee, has also co-chaired the AAP's task force on obesity, and in 2010 was the recipient of the Samuel J. Foman Nutrition Award from the American Academy of Pediatrics. So please join me in welcoming Professor Krebs as our guest speaker this afternoon.
Okay, well, thank you, Scott. And it's really a pleasure to be here. In fact, it's really an honor to really hear about your Global Health Center and all the work that goes on here. I mean, I already knew you were well known for your international work and for your residency program. You're one of our major competitors as far as medical students who they either want to go to Colorado or more likely they want to go to Seattle. So, but I've had a wonderful day, and it's just been really thought-provoking for me to be here. So I hope that I can offer you some things to think about as well. My outline today is to go over a bit about stunting, knowing that many of you are doing infectious disease and may not, don't think about growth day in and day out. And then talk a little bit about the strategies that you'll see in the literature as far as how we should reduce stunting, i.e. what works. And there's been lots of things published about this. And what I'm going to kind of do is sort of say, well, all that sounds really good, but here's some of the data. And I guess that my passion has been in terms of international health. I haven't gone and done service in developing countries. I kind of go in for a week or so to see the site where we're going to do the research, but it's really been about research and feeling that infants and children deserve to have good research, good evidence base on which to base on the policies and the practices that we recommend. And so that's been my commitment to, or my interest in doing the international work. So I'm going to share some of the results of our interventions that we've done, and then really talk a little bit about where has that led our thinking, and to a grant that we've talked about throughout the day a little bit about, that we're very excited to be undertaking. So this slide reminds us about stunting, the prevalence of stunting, and that is showing, so stunting overall is about 32% of children under 5. And why do we care about stunting? And it's that, it doesn't get the newspaper headlines. It's not like famines. Stunting, but it's being short for your age is associated with worse physical outcomes, morbidity, mortality, with definitely lower human capacity or human capital, and also with cognitive development and so on. So there's a lot of things that go with stunting that we think resolve along with having better growth. But the stunting itself is sort of a proxy for, it represents an environment that you've grown up in, and a nutritional environment that you've grown up in, or that you're living in. So what this slide shows here is 62 countries have stunting rates over 20%. These are from Bob Black's data in The Lancet, and as far as I'm aware, there aren't any newer data than these. But what you see is in the red are the areas over 40% stunting for children under 5, and Sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia are the big areas where stunting is still a very high prevalence. And then actually where we've done a lot of work is in Guatemala, so one little pocket here in Latin America that has profoundly high stunting rates. So I'm going to spend a little time on this slide just to get you oriented to z-scores and how we think about growth. But this was published in 2010 by Cesar Vectora, and it's showing from 54 countries the growth patterns. And so this is longitudinal from basically 1 month of age out to 5 years. And what we have here is, in the blue line is length for age z-score. So these are all z-scores on the y-axis. And here we see height or length for age, and then the green bar is weight for age. And as many of you know, and as we've talked some throughout the day, weight for age that was one of the Millennium Development Goals, to reduce that. Whereas and you can see that is actually, the numbers are higher here. I mean, they don't have as bad as z-scores as the length for age. So stunting, it turns out, is much more prevalent than wasting, and it's also much tougher to deal with. But this line on the weight for age is really reflecting that these are shorter kids, so we would expect them not to weigh as much. So it isn't that they're getting skinny. And we can say that based on this red line, which is the weight for length, and that's basically like a BMI. It's putting the two together. And really, when you put the two together, you see they're right at the 0, or you can think of that as the 50th percentile. So these are not skinny kids. So they're sort of invisible, because they don't look like the skinny children that you see in the newspapers. But so the stunting is what is much more prevalent and much more severe. The other thing I want you to notice is that this is a downward trend that starts almost immediately after birth and just keeps on going through the first 2 years of life, and then kind of levels out. And so this is also part of the challenge, in that after 2 years, or the thinking has been that after 2 years, it's very difficult to reverse. What I'm going to show you is it's pretty difficult to reverse even before that. But this has led to this whole concept of the critical window, and these are part of the 1,000 days, and the other, so this is about 600, 700 days in the first 2 years of life, and then back further, including pregnancy, to make the 1,000 days that everyone is talking about these days. But so this is why the critical window, because this is where that sharp decline in linear growth, or length for age. So when we think about, well, how would we tackle this and how would we, what's driving the linear growth faltering? This is from Kay Dewey, a review she did in 2008. And so here's our linear growth up here. And what are the various factors that could affect this? Well, I want to, and this is again on just linear growth, and so proximal factors that could affect linear growth during the complementary feeding period. So she was looking at just what could you do to improve nutrition and what would be the effect on growth during that period. And I point out that 6 months is where she starts. So this is saying, you're going to exclusively breastfeed for the first 6 months. So we don't talk about changing that, but really what can you do with complementary feeding? And so you have morbidity that is, of course, going to have a negative impact on linear growth. You have breast milk intake that if you don't have good breast milk intake, that can contribute to morbidity and then go on up there. The quality and the quality and the quantity of complementary foods could be, if they're good, they could have a positive effect on linear growth. But if they're not so good, then they can also contribute to morbidity by malnutrition or micronutrient deficiencies causing more susceptibility to especially infectious morbidity. So that's that was the kind of model that she was taking to do this review. And I'm going to really go over just a very brief, very broadly the findings that she had for that. But I also want to, before that, talk about, well, what are we talking about as far as improving complementary feeding? Well, this is from guidelines that actually Kay Dewey was probably a first author in, from the World Health Organization and the Pan American Health Organization. And so what do we say we should do? Well, first of all, promote exclusive breastfeeding for 6 months and maintain breastfeeding beyond that. Now, I want to remind you that when this came out in 2004, I believe, was when the WHO passed, kind of made that recommendation. This was not based on that this will improve growth. The data was really that it'll reduce diarrhea. So the idea being that if you can delay the onset or the utilization of complementary foods, which are likely to bring in more germs and hygiene issues and more diarrhea, that the longer you could do that, the better you could go. But nobody was comfortable going past 6 months on that. But it wasn't to say that you'd meet your micronutrient deficiencies. It wasn't to say you'd grow better. It wasn't to say you'd prevent allergies and so on. So it's important to put that in the context of where did this recommendation come from. And there have been many people who haven't really accepted that. But nevertheless, that's where we are, where we're starting, where that still is our recommendation to exclusively breastfeed for 6 months. Then the next point was to do responsive feeding, so not forcing children and following their satiety cues and so on. And this may seem like sort of soft recommendation, but in fact, the feeding process is a very dynamic process, and children won't necessarily eat if it's an aversive experience. And so that is actually a very important part of good complementary feeding. And then, of course, safe preparation and storage of the complementary foods. So again, trying to get at the hygiene part. And food consistency, so using thick, not thin gruels and soups to increase the energy density of the foods. And then meal frequency, so you don't wait on the infant to demand to be fed, but rather you promote a kind of a schedule and frequent feeds throughout the day. And again, the energy density, that you're not just giving them this kind of broth that has very little in the way of energy as well as micronutrients. And so, but then the next part of it was, so what kinds of foods? So the nutrient content was also very important in this document. And so variety was emphasized. Again, to avoid micronutrient deficiencies, the best thing you can do is to have a very diverse diet because there's no single food that will provide all your nutrient requirements. The next point is, and I put this in here and in italics because this is not my idea, because you'll see that many of the studies we've done have dealt with the whole animal source foods issue. But in these recommendations, meat, poultry, fish, or eggs should be eaten daily or as often as possible. And that's because of the micronutrients that are contained in those foods you really don't get in adequate amounts in other foods. And furthermore, it states that vegetarian diets cannot meet nutrient needs at this age unless nutrient supplements or fortified products are used. That's pretty clear-cut, black and white recommendations. So either you got to have one or the other, either access to meat, poultry, or fish, or you have to have supplementation or fortification. So those are the guidelines. So in terms of strategies and this that people have looked at in terms of improving complementary feeding, there's education. talking to mothers about better practices and trying to implement some of these guidelines. There's providing actually an intervention that provides a complementary food or a food product to provide more energy and more micronutrients. Or others have tried actually providing food and some other, combining that with education or some other strategy. Other approaches have been to actually just micronutrient fortify. We've gone way beyond thinking that it's just about calories and protein, and recognizing that some essential micronutrients, specifically zinc and iron and vitamin A, and to a lesser extent folate, and then maybe vitamin D, but that really its micronutrients are equally important to energy and protein and the macronutrients. So then the approach has been to, well, could we just improve the micronutrient quality of the complementary foods? And you can do that either by fortifying grains in a central kind of location, or you can do that now with the sprinkles or the sachets that you put on your home porridge, and do that in the home. And then other approaches have been to just try to increase the energy density and or the nutrient bioavailability in the complementary feeding by the simple technologies. And that's things like reducing the phytate by using fermentation procedures that moms can do in the homes. So kind of low tech, but actually trying to get at absorption, better absorption or bioavailability of particularly of the micronutrients. So in Kay's review, a summary of these trials, and again, this was through 2008, she looked at and I've only highlighted 4 of the approaches here, but for those that have tried just education only, a modest effect with efficacy trials. There was basically 1 out of 6 that had a significant effect. And those that had more of an effect were larger programmatic kinds of trials, like working through the health center. But the effect size was about 0.2 to 0.3, so not dramatically big impact on linear growth. And these are all ones that had impact on what I'm reviewing here is the outcomes on linear growth specifically. There's many more impacts on weight gain. So it's not that hard to get babies to gain weight or children to gain weight, or adults, as a matter of fact. But getting them to grow taller is a much tougher issue, or longer. And then the approaches that have tried providing complementary foods, like a fortified food, there were 8 trials, and really the results were all over the map, so inconsistent that there really was not a significant effect overall. The micronutrient fortification approaches, again, 1 out of 6 were positive, and these were efficacy trials. And here again, the effect size on linear growth, or the LAZ, was only 0.12. So some effect, but not curing stunting. And then those that have looked at increasing the energy density of foods, 2 out of 5 had positive results, and again, our effect size of about 0.23, but a huge range here. So again, this is encompassing in one slide a whole lot of work and literature, but really to just point out that it's been a tough thing to actually find an intervention that will work, and to try to do it in a controlled trial, and to really carefully evaluate that. So I want to, since I thought, well, I need to, 2008's now been several years back, and so I thought, well, let's see what's been done recently. And one of the ones, trials that was actually in that review, but now they've done follow-up work, is one that was done in China. And the colleagues worked with Johns Hopkins, and Laura Caulfield was involved in this. And this was an intensive nutrition education. So it was done through the health centers, but they worked directly with the moms, and to just really teach about those guidelines that I just talked about. I mean, all those principles, and they really emphasize like their food choices and their feeding styles and so on. And so it was a cluster randomized trial to look at the effectiveness of just an education intervention on feeding practices and growth. They enrolled babies when they were 2 to 4 months of age, and then they followed them through 18 months. And they had at 18 months, they'd had 240 of the initial 251 in the intervention group finish, and in the control group, they had 220 out of 277 that they had longitudinal data on. So pretty good follow-up. The intervention was an enhanced home-prepared recipes, food preparation, like I said, just about everything you can think of, hygiene, counseling about complementary feeding, including the timing and the quality, behaviors. I remember specifically they talked about incorporating an egg a day into the diet, and more animal products and so on. So really, I mean, to read through the paper was lovely in terms of all the things they tried to cover. And the education was, as I say, delivered through the health system. So they found significantly improved knowledge and behaviors on the part of the moms, and that was on the basis of the infant-child feeding index, which is a kind of a qualitative scale, but that's been validated. They found improved weight for age z-scores and weight for height or weight for length z-scores with the intervention compared to the control. And stunting was decreased, but it was the intervention group was 3.2% stunting versus 7.1% in the control group. So perhaps right off that strikes you as that they didn't really have that much stunting. I mean, those are not dramatic numbers. So perhaps that's why they had an effect. But their odds ratio on this was 0.7, and the range, the confidence intervals from 0.53 to 0.94. But so what does this look like on a, when we put it like compared to the Victoria kind of plot? Here's their LAZ, and so here's starting at, I just took an average of 3 months, and here's the square black line is the control group, and then here's the intervention group. And so you can see that both of them by 6 months had started to come down on their LAZs for, and then kind of bottomed out here around 12 months, and then by 18 months started to come up. And here's where our difference is, but this actually was not significant. It was close. I mean, I think there was like a trend, but it was not actually a significant difference here. But you see overall that they still ended up worse than where they started. And so keep that picture in your mind because this will come back. But anyway, so this was a relatively successful trial, and just with education. Well, just. It was an aggressive education intervention. So I highlighted the meat issue and the recommendation from WHO to incorporate animal source foods. Again, I'm a micronutrient, I'm a trace mineral person, and so meats are your best sources of those. So when we were thinking about embarking on this trial with meat and to, as an intervention for complementary feeding, we said, well, what's the evidence for a positive impact of meat as a complementary food? I mean, did WHO just make that theoretically, or is there evidence on that? Well, the evidence was really mostly association. Improved linear growth from epidemiologic data. There was a lot to say those infants, toddlers that had meat in the diet actually grew better. There was one intervention trial, and this was one that I actually mentioned before, that was done in Peru by Mary Penny, where they, again, it was education, but they encouraged the mothers to include what they called a special food, but that special food was like chicken liver or eggs or some kind of a meat or animal source food daily. And they followed them, I believe, for a whole year, and they saw an effect on linear growth. But that is one of the shining examples of a positive intervention. There was also some data, again, just association of better psychomotor development at 24 months for those that had meat in the diet. This actually wasn't in developing a low resource setting. There was improved hemoglobin at 10 months. Again, this was in Scandinavia. And then a pilot study that we had done, again, prior to taking on this intervention trial, was that we had growth measurements, and then we had some basic dietary information. And in that, we saw that meat intake was significantly protective against stunting. So that kind of, again, gave us the courage to go forward with this intervention trial. But one of the problems with this is meat reflecting better socioeconomic status, and we didn't really have a way to tease that out. But one could ask that in about a number of these trials: is that just a proxy for saying, you know, you're in a better situation and can afford the meat, or is it really the meat itself? But that said, we undertook what we called the First Bites trial, and this was undertaken through the Global Health Network that Scott mentioned, and this is an NIH-NICHD supported 7-country network. We could only afford to do this in 4 countries, but those 4 countries were Guatemala and Zambia and Pakistan and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this is just an overview of the kind of goals and study design. So the broad goal was, of course, to improve growth and health and development of infants and young children by improving the quality of complementary feeding. And so this was to take on to say, really do an efficacy trial, and if you got meat into the mouths of these babies essentially every day, would you affect growth? We didn't say would you cure stunting, but would you improve growth? And so it was an efficacy trial of if we provided meat versus a fortified cereal as an early complementary food, what would be the outcome? The design was a randomized cluster design, and we started feeding the meat at 6 months and then did it for the next year, as well as the cereal. And we gave a 1/2 ounce to 3/4 ounce, so at a year it went up to 3/4 ounce. And our idea here was that this met zinc requirements, but we knew it would be close for iron, but we thought it might be enough if you had enough bioavailability coming from the heme iron. But that's what this was based on, and we also didn't want to overdo it because a 1/2 ounce a day sounds like that would be kind of maybe attainable. If we went further than that, we were concerned that it really was going to be totally unrealistic, and many said this would be unrealistic anyway. But anyway, so that's how much we gave them and why. And then for the comparison group, we gave them a micronutrient fortified rice soy cereal, which was equal caloric to the meat. And the meat was providing 70 calories. So we, again, were going on the basis that stunting was the issue, not wasting. So it wasn't calories that they needed, they just needed better complementary foods. And so what you notice is I don't have a third box here saying, do we have a control group that really got nothing and that we could just monitor growth at the same time. So that is a limitation of the study. We don't know if maybe we helped, but we certainly didn't, as you'll see. These comparisons were a little disappointing. Both groups got 3 messages on complementary feeding that were delivered by our health research workers and throughout the health system as well. We had posters and so on. And emphasizing, I don't think I have this on here, we emphasized the thick gruels over thin, feeding 3 times a day, and to diversify their diets as much as they could. These were very impoverished settings, and so we knew that they were limited, but whatever they could do within their setting to do that as far as diversifying the diet. And the primary outcome was linear growth velocity. So these were the participants. We had basically 300 in each site, a total of over 1,200 children. So I believe this is the largest study that's been done in around complementary feeding and an intervention like this. So 20 clusters of meat and 20 clusters of the cereal. And the data collection was completed now almost 2 years ago. But again, this was our pilot data because we wanted to be sure that we had communities that we had significant stunting if we were going to have an effect. And so these were the stunting rates and for each of the countries. And so we had no problem having enough stunting. So Guatemala and DRC were over 60% of stunting, and this was between 12 and 24 months. And then Zambia and Pakistan had a mere 44%. So the average, so it was 44 up to 66% stunting rates. In contrast, and this just emphasizes what I said before, was that the wasting was very, very not prevalent. So Guatemala almost undetectable, and even DRC, not very much, and Zambia less, and a bit, Pakistan had the highest at 9%. But so you can see stunting was what dominates the picture here in terms of malnutrition and growth faltering. So, and this is just a slide showing the difference between the foods. So again, remembering the meat is just a single food, and we don't really expect it to meet all nutrient needs, but we were hoping that the rest of the diet would make up the gaps. And then the fortified cereal, of course, had, in the green here, had much more of some of the micronutrients, so much more folate. There was actually more B12 in the meat, and we based these amounts on recommendations that have been made for if you're going to fortify foods, how much would you put in of these various nutrients. The iron was quite a bit higher in the cereal, but again, we were hoping on the bioavailability of the iron from the meat, and then zinc was actually equivalent. And then the macronutrient distribution was, of course, also very, very different. So carbohydrates dominated for the cereal calories, no fat in the cereal, and then and a bit, some more, not high fat, but in the meat. And then protein, of course, was quite a bit higher. And there's just sort of no way around it. We didn't really think protein was likely to be limiting, but you can't give meat and not give protein. So, so that came along with it. So here's our results. So the meat group, so this is linear growth velocity over the year, and this is centimeters per month. And so the meat group had 1 centimeter per month, and the cereal group had 1.02 centimeters per month. So really not even close to a significant difference here. So this was disappointing. I mean, I think there's no question that we improved the quality of the complementary foods in these populations because we knew what they were eating, and I can't, like I say, I don't think there was any way we didn't improve the quality. And this is putting it graphically, showing it graphically, and so couple things to notice here. Again, the two lines for the two groups are very, very close. The meat group, maybe there was a 0.1 trend for a significant difference for the first 6 months, but then that was not sustained, and so by 18 months, essentially no difference. But notice also, and I think I actually, let's see what, yeah, so notice also that they're starting here at 6 months at below 1 standard deviation. So the z-score already by 6 months is quite low and then just continued on downwards. And the stunting rates were like 30% when we started and over 50 or about 50% when we finished. So these are the other anthro scores, and so you can, so again, here's our linear growth and then our weight for age and our weight for length, and you can see again that for each group they're essentially on top of each other. So no difference in groups. When we put this onto the Victoria plot that I showed you earlier, here's where we started. So we were in a pretty deep hole before we ever even had our intervention started. And I think this is what's really important to understand, is that when you've got severe stunting, it's, again, really hard to reverse that and to have an impact. And again, I don't know if the others in the community would have been even lower or would have ended up lower than this star, but nevertheless, I mean, we ended up right at a mean of -2 z-score, which is the definition of stunting, as our mean. And so it's very sobering, I guess is why I'm emphasizing all this. So a few other outcomes of that study. When we looked at, so our treatment didn't have a significant effect, but by complex modeling, we found the significant predictors of linear growth were maternal education, strongly significant in more education, better growth. Maternal height was also significantly predictive of linear growth velocity. Boys did worse. Which has also been reported in the literature, but our Pakistani colleagues in particular were quite concerned. I mean, their bias is that the boy babies get preferable treatment, and so they actually thought that we would have better growth in response to the intervention than for the girls, but in fact we didn't see that at all. The boys did worse. And then study site, there were differences across the sites, but it wasn't powered to look at individual sites, so I really can't say any more than that, just the different effects in different places. And then sort of counterintuitively, the 6-month length for age z-score, the lower it was, the better their response was. So maybe there was something fixable there, or something a little bit more responsive early on, because that actually turned out to be quite significant. But again, we didn't really change the curve very much, so I'm not quite sure how to interpret that. When we looked at the biomarkers, iron status was actually better in the cereal group, and as I showed you, they got about 3 times more iron. So hemoglobin, no differences in anemia, which actually these anemia rates are fairly low, so perhaps, and again, we don't have control data, but maybe again we improved the iron status of both groups. But ferritin was lower, significantly lower in the meat group, and the soluble transferrin receptors, which deficiency is associated with a higher level, that was higher in the meat group. And then zinc didn't vary at all between the two groups. And again, remembering they got very similar intakes of zinc, and B12 was the same as well. And I think, yeah, and cognitive, we did cognitive outcomes and really didn't see differences by group either. So that was the first BITES trial. And concurrently, or at about the same time frame, we started a similar design in China, where we had colleagues doing zinc work before, and we knew stunting rates were around 20 to 30%. So in this trial, we did another cluster randomized trial, again, feeding from 6 to 18 months. And here we used pork, because that's a more acceptable meat than beef. And we used 50 grams per day there, instead of the only about an ounce a day. And then compared to a multi-micronutrient commercially available fortified cereal, and then just a locally available non-fortified cereal. So here we actually had a control group. And again, our primary outcome was linear growth, and then we also had biomarkers at 18 months. So here we see the results. And so here the meat actually, I mean, again, these are not big differences, but the meat actually, there was a significant benefit, but just not a very large one. But it was about, I think about 0.5 centimeters per I think at the end it was 0.5 centimeters difference. And then here, the fortified cereal is in the kind of gold bar here, and you can see that they actually tumbled down further, and then the unfortified cereal ended up at about the same place as the fortified. So kind of to our surprise, when we thought the unfortified cereal would do the worst, but in fact, it wasn't that clear cut. But what I also want you to see is, again, we didn't really change the downward trajectory of the LAZ scores. And so you're thinking, didn't I just see that pattern? And so yes, you did. So here's first bites, a little bit lower. I mean, starting at between -1 and 1.5. And here we started at about between -0.5 and -1, but still going down further over the course of the study. So the severity of stunting in the first bites trial was, the multi-country trial was more severe. The progression and the slope was similar, and it was really minimally impacted by the nutritional interventions that we undertook. So one question is, does the deficit at 6 months require a more potent intervention? So did we need to give more of our micronutrient fortified foods? You know, that's an open question, especially when you're starting so low. Did you need more to catch up? Whereas if they'd started closer to 50th percentile, maybe it wouldn't have taken so much, or maybe they wouldn't have declined so much. But at any rate, these are some of the questions we're left with. In the China trial, we also had iron status. And here, I think, I want to, again, kind of raise a question about how do we design these trials and some of the unintended consequences we might encounter. So here again are the 3 groups, so meat, and then the fortified cereal, and then the local cereal. And if you look at dietary iron, they weren't very different across the way, although the fortified cereal did have significantly more, but not hugely more. Iron status was best in the fortified cereal. So this is body iron, and this is the index of putting ferritin over transferrin receptors to sort of account for the potential inflammatory response. And here, again, the cereal group looked, the fortified cereal group was the best, and this was a significant difference, whereas the meat and the local cereal were not different. And the percent of those with iron deficiency was lowest, significantly lowest in the fortified cereal group. So that all sounds good. So wouldn't you want to just give fortified cereal? But when we also looked at markers of inflammation, and here it's a bit of a different story. So here, so iron is a very double-edged sword, and it is a pro-inflammatory factor if you don't need iron, and so especially, so if you're iron repleted and you're getting extra iron. And so I think that's maybe what we're seeing here is that in the iron-fortified cereal group, they actually had higher inflammatory markers, which may relate to higher ferritin as well. But at any rate, here is the significantly higher inflammatory markers, the alpha-glycoprotein, and fecal calprotectin, a marker of intestinal inflammation, was also highest in that group. So we know iron given as electrolytic iron in cereal is not very well absorbed, and so it's sitting there in the intestine and maybe stirring up maybe changes in the microbiome, maybe changes in just in interaction with the host and in terms of stimulating an inflammatory response. So I think, to me, this gives us pause in terms of what might be unintended consequences of different interventions. We're following up on some of these data. But iron is a very challenging issue because it's very common. Deficiency is very common. So your instinct is to just give everyone iron because they probably need it, but not all of them do need it. And so if they don't need it, then this may be, again, an unintended consequence that might have some effects. So with that, so a look forward. So what is going on here? So next time you hear somebody talk about improving complementary feeding, think of these studies that we've done and say, well, wait a minute, it's not necessarily that simple. So what else could be driving the stunting? Well, again, to come back to our conceptual model, again, this is on linear growth, and it's during the complementary feeding period. But when we look at all of these factors, is this the story? Well, again, here's what's been touted as part of the critical window, but when it's dropping off so early on, it really says there must be something going on back here. And so that's really where our thinking has moved. And this is also supported by some data that we obtained in Guatemala, where again, they have profound stunting rates in the indigenous populations. And this was looking, we had noted in our other trials that even by 6 months, their average Z-score was a -2. So we had some medical students that went down to Guatemala for a year and got birth lengths, which are not very readily available, and got birth lengths and then got it measured again at 3 months and at 6 months. And what you see is the biggest drop is between birth and 3 months. And then it drops a little bit further to 6 months. But again, when we're intervening not until here, a lot has already happened by then. So these were strongly significant. The other, and then here's our weight for age that didn't budge at all. So just for those, so my other hat is that I do some obesity work, and we're interested in how early obesity seems to be starting. And so here we see that in those that were stunted, I mean, as the linear growth is going downwards, the weight gain is really staying the same. So therefore, that weight for length is going up. And so at 3 months, we actually had over 40% above the 95th percentile. So not just above zero, but in fact above, so qualifying as overweight by the WHO standards. And by 6 months, it's still a quarter of them were overweight. So linear growth faltering is not associated with a proportional compensation to slow down your weight gain. And so whatever is impairing linear growth is actually not interfering with fat deposition. And we didn't have body composition data on this, but one wonders if that's some of the central adiposity that then sets them up for, chronic disease risk later on. So this is just showing means, and when we looked at actual individuals, this is a complicated regression that my colleague Leland Miller does, but what we're seeing here is, so here's LAZ at 3 months versus weight for age, WAZ at 3 months, and we have a significant slope. And let's see, so the identity line is this one, and because they're so stunted, so this is not at the origin, but rather down here at a -4, and then here's the regression line. And to make a complex story short or simpler, is the divergence of this regression line from the identity line. As the LAZ gets lower, the weight for age, and the weight for age is lower, so the more stunted you are, the more disproportionate your weight for age is. And so again, the more stunted, the higher your risk is of having an excessive rate of weight gain. So again, it's not just about calories. There's a real, growth is very complex, and there's probably several things going on here, but there are data in the literature for older children that are stunted having higher rates of overweight. And so this may be starting right here in infancy as well, or even before that. That's a bit of a diversion to the obesity side of things. So other factors, well, in 0 to 6 months, what is going on there? I mean, in Guatemala, they're breastfeeding. They may not be exclusively breastfeeding for a whole 6 months, but they certainly were breastfeeding by 3 months, mostly breastfeeding. So is breastfeeding adequate times 6 months as advocated by the WHO? Again, remember the trade-offs that you have to make when you make these recommendations, but maybe it's not. Is the quality of human milk more variable and possibly inadequate than we've previously assumed, including for micronutrients? We know it probably isn't the zinc, because zinc isn't related to the maternal diet, nor the iron, which also isn't very much related to maternal dietary intake. But there's other micronutrients in there that could well be affecting growth that are affected by maternal diet. So, I stand up in front of classes, or I have for years said, it's just the quantity will go down, but the quality is pretty well maintained. Well, I think that's now a question that we can't necessarily say with such confidence. So human milk is back on the table as far as maybe it's not as perfect as we thought. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't breastfeed, but we, again, need to figure out what's going on, what's driving that, if it is a human milk issue. And then are there non-nutritional qualities in human milk that may adversely affect growth? So in that, we're looking at women in the US who have insulin resistance, who have obesity, and looking at cytokines and inflammatory markers, and those do get transmitted to the milk. And maybe they're somehow impacting both infant linear growth, or maybe intake, or maybe fat deposition, and so on. So human milk is a very dynamic fluid and complicated fluid. And so we can't sort of think, well, we just define what it is and then assume it's that way for everyone, that women's status really probably does affect the composition of bioactive compounds in human milk. But all of this at this point is speculative. So non-nutritional factors, what else could be going on? Well, another example of another potential explanation is the fecal calprotectin, a marker of gut inflammation. In these same Chinese infants, we actually had the opportunity to get stool samples, and at about 6 months of age, and we compared then their LAZ status and rural versus urban, and the rural had lower LAZs, and that was significant. And the median fecal calprotectin in the rural was considerably higher, significantly higher than the urban calprotectin. So again, calprotectin being a marker of intestinal inflammation. And statistically anyway, there was an inverse correlation between LAZ and fecal calprotectin levels to the 0.01 level. So again, suggesting there's inflammation going on there, that maybe that's also interfering or impacting linear growth potential. So just an example of another factor. And then there's all these others. So maternal education and male gender, infectious morbidity, indoor air pollution, environmental enteropathy. There's a lot of interest in that and what the interaction may be there on linear growth and micronutrient absorption and so on. The microbiome, we're starting to look at data there. Again, what may be that interaction between the host and the microbes and immune factors and inflammatory factors and so on. And then other maternal factors and when to intervene. So probably backing further back in that critical window. I think I've got this on one more slide. So postnatal nutrition is important. I mean, I'm a nutrition person, and I don't want to say that really there's no point in bothering with postnatal nutrition. But it's clearly interacting with other factors, and it's not as simple as just, let's go in and boost up the nutrition. I've had to accept that. There are numerous complementary feeding interventions that have had limited impact on the profound linear growth faltering that afflicts infants and toddlers in low resource settings. And many interventions and a bit of success here and there, but certainly not changing that overall downward trajectory. And so I think we still have a lot to learn about what is driving that and what can we do about it. And finally, that the solutions are likely to be multifactorial and almost certainly need to start earlier. And so as I've had the chance to share with a number of you, we actually have now, from the generous support of the Gates Foundation, are undertaking a preconception intervention to say if we improve maternal nutritional status prior to conceiving, will their birth outcomes be better? And so our primary outcome is actually linear LAZs at birth and then again at 6 months to see if we can have a better, that first 6-month interval by helping the mother do better and intervening very early. So with that, this is just our funding and that all of these studies have kind of come from, and that's Colorado, and I gather last night we had a little bit more snow, but these are really the most special kids in our studies, and so thank you, and maybe we have a few minutes for questions. So thank you.